Hello and welcome, Neko AV here with another video, and this one's going to be me talking about pop culture. Now, initially I've been working on trying to figure out how to do a video on modern music, the state of modern music, but I found that there's still so much that I need to read up on and understand, and so that's probably going to take me maybe a year before I release that. But I cannot understand mainstream music without first understanding pop culture, which of course is short for popular culture. And what is popular culture is basically the culture of the populace. What is the average person, the so-called normal person or normie. And so this is going to be a video where I get into that. And this is something that I've been thinking of for like a long time now. Now, before I get into the other references, I do have to point out that I've been reading up on various uh, websites based on things like psychology and stuff like that about like the effects of boredom and monotony on the brain and how people react to it. And while there is a lot of weird information in relation to that, some may even relate to pseudoscience, there is one thing that I've come to learn, which is that yeah, people who will in fact seek out something new because a new experience can cause the brain to mentally stimulate. You get those mental chemicals flowing through the brain. I'm not going to go into the deep science about all the different chemicals and what they do and stuff like that. But yes, those chemicals end up flowing. But when we come across an old experience, you don't have that chemical flow, not a lot of energy being used for the chemicals and the mental processes because the mind's going off of what it already knows rather than learning the new experience. Likewise, people will also use what they've experienced to define whatever new experiences that they are having. And also, sometimes people will stay away from new experiences simply because it's unfamiliar, as well as the fact that they don't know they won't know much about the other experience. And as of course, someone comes along and tells them. Now, with all that out of the way, onto the video references. Now, this is something that I've often thought about and have for at least 15 years now, which started right up there with Language is a Map by Tim O'Reilly. And the big thing and it relates heavily to this, which is that when we experience something, we define it, we add labels to that experience. And when we come across a new experience, we try to apply the labels that we have, what definitions we have to that new experience. Unfortunately, this can also lead into like biases and getting lost in the labels and stuff like that. And another thing to point out that that is recognized in Tim O'Reilly's presentation is that what we experience isn't reality in the whole. And he demonstrates this with what's referred to as a structural differential. Basically, you have the larger model that represents everything. You have a small circle attached to that model, which represents an individual experience within that larger space. And then the tags, which is basically what we define that smaller circle, that individual experience that each of us share. It is a fascinating thing to watch, so I strongly recommend watching it rather than just take my word for it. Same with the other videos that I have on the side there. Now, both the Normies video by David Stewart and Proof of Real Life Non-Player Characters by Aidan Paladin, both of them basically touch on the same thing, but in different ways. See, the thing about Normies, from what I've learned, and as I've been told, is that they don't go seeking out new experiences by themselves. It does play back into that whole thing of sticking to what's familiar rather than what may be new and exciting and what have you. Or at least waiting to be told what other people experience and build off of what they experience rather than their own experience. you have stuff like that happens. That's how it is with the normies. And oftentimes they don't go deep into whatever the subject may be. This is also why a lot of times with music, because music is like one of the biggest things of importance to me, why when it comes to music, a lot of people will tend to not be able to recognize what kind of music is out there. It's because while you have the hobbyists and the enthusiasts who absolutely love and embrace the new music that's out, or even whatever may be that someone is unaware of is out there, whatever niche may be. Whereas the normies, they tend to just not know it's there because either A, they have not heard from someone who is an enthusiast or a hobbyist who's into that media, be it not just with the music, but also with like video games, TV shows, and stuff like that. Not only that, but as far as they're concerned, that stuff doesn't even exist because, well, it's not in front of them, nor is the audience that enjoys that stuff is interacting with them, And because people are so heavily reliant on the labels and what they see, and because of the whole thing about how the brain functions, we get into this thing that a lot of people like to refer to as real life NPCs, where people don't act like normal people, but instead act like a shell of a regular person. And this can be from a lot of different things, kind of like what I talked about in a previous video of mine where I was talking about Idiocracy, Paranoia Agent, and The Running Man, in which case, the short of it of what I said in that video, feel free to watch that one if you wish, is that people tend to get lost in whatever media they consume and they become delusional because they don't really think much more in relation to that. And a lot of this so-called NPC stuff tends to be from people who basically just rely on the memory and react to that, as well as reacting to outward stimulation, I should be saying, much akin to what David Stewart said of normies. The whole thing of reacting to what's in front of them rather than seeking out what is there, And with the so-called NPCs, let's just say there aren't really NPCs to begin with. That's more of what would be referred to as a simulacrum, which I will get into in a minute. But yeah, basically a lot of people, they don't really think about what they're doing. And sometimes they're even in the middle of doing other stuff. And because they're often busy with other things, they don't often have the mental energy to seek things out. And so they just react to stuff, or instead of putting so much energy into having those brain chemicals function and flow, they just rely on memory and whatever external stimuli may be necessary to function. Basically kind of like how people just sort of go into autopilot. It sort of a biological means of conserving one's own energy in a sense. So, in other words, people aren't NPCs. It's just they start engaging in normie-like behavior, and a lot of times it could just be because they are tired from whatever their daily activity may be. I've heard. Okay, I'm not going to get into that because that's going to be going off topic, but yeah, this actually makes sense about like how normies are the way they are and how pop culture is shaped, and these tend to be the majority of the populace, and this is why pop culture is shaped the way it is. Why that certain music is just not popular? It's because it's not introduced to the majority, and the majority at times may have their mind on something else and may not even pay attention. Now, of course, so comes to the bottom video, latest thing that I've seen, which is things AI will never understand by Fractal Philosophy. Now, this is where I got the word simulacrum from. And while there's a lot to go into in that for a future video that I'm going to be doing, what what was said on that channel works very well in relation to all of this, which is that how you have the central event, and then you have people presenting their interpretation of that event, which would be as defined as a simulation, and then you got other people building off of that, which in turn creates another simulation. And of course, you get into things like heuristics and stuff like that. But eventually, another situation can happen, and sometimes people may wonder if this is related or not. And some people may not even be aware of what may have happened. It could have been something much akin to what would be referred to as telephone game, in which case one person says something and another person says something else, and eventually whatever the original meaning of the first sentence is lost. It's something that happens. And it stops being a simulation of what was previously said and instead becomes a simulacrum. It's completely different from the original message, the original intent, and stuff like that, which is also why I make references in my videos. So you could always at least check back with those sources, and if those sources have their own citations, check back with those as well. But yeah, this is how media and how people perceive media also tends to get very weird. Because there's often a disconnect between the hobbyists, the enthusiasts, and the normies. Of course, though, this doesn't get into other things that people like David Stewart talked about, such as the so-called bugmen, the people who will just consume, and the people who try to market to said bugmen. That's also does have an effect, and normies will, of course, follow in that if whatever is being consumed is available. If not, the normies go on to something else, depending on what grabs their attention. But at the same time, the normies also are getting a lot of this information that they are defining from their experience. And if a lot of that's coming from a simulation, at some point, the original definition is lost, and what they have is their own definition. And at some point, you end up with a simulacrum. At least that's what it sounds like to me. And this is why pop culture is in the weird state it is now. This also kind of relates to what I want to talk about with modern music. But yeah, this is how it is. Got people with completely different definitions of what the original definition is of something. Good example of this is what I've seen previously of a YouTube short talking about the so-called devil horns in rock and roll. Some said it originated from Dio, who got it from his grandmother, who was using it as a means to ward off evil. And then you got those who, after seeing it at so many rock shows that they don't understand, that assume that it's not a symbol to ward off evil, but a symbol to invite evil. Now, I think that is a good example of a simulacrum is, at least from what I'm trying to understand. But in a strange way, it does make sense. Why is pop culture in the weird state it is? It may not even be anything that we've discussed, just that how information changes from person to person. It's also why, when it comes to things like modern lingo with skibbity, despite being the modern day Numa Numa, people look at it as something completely different because of some weird animation with toilet people. So those are my thoughts. Feel free to, if you have anything to share, feel free to share it. Agree, disagree, maybe I misunderstood something. With all that said, I am Neko AV, and I thank you for watching.